everyone. I'm super excited to be here. So as the title suggests, I'm going to speak about the idea of sustainable wearables and heirloom electronics. So if you go out shopping in America today for clothes, you will probably see a scene very close to this one, surrounded by cheap clothes and lots of them. Now, I think this is a common occurrence because of the economic system we live in, which is a capitalist one, but also other factors that are largely part of that system. So in this presentation, I'm going to explore where capitalism has gotten the fashion and the electronic industry, and where we may want to go from here as we push fashion and electronics to merge. So I'm going to start here, before the Industrial Revolution. Now, before the 1800s, all clothing and textiles were handmade. All garments were cut and sewn by women in the family or community tailors. Then technological inventions like this one, the spinning jenny, came around in the 1700s, which was then followed by the sewing machine in the 1800s, and these kicked off the Industrial Revolution. So for the very first time, the creation of textiles and clothing were leaving the home and being housed under large factory roofs. So when the Industrial Revolution happened, this of course changed everything and how fabric and clothing were produced. The first ready-to-wear clothing collection was created, which meant standardized sizing, and garments could now be made in multiples and very quickly. So customization was starting to be traded for efficiency and standardization. Now, the sewing machine became a very common household tool and a really important skill to learn. It automated the chore of hand stitching and brought the standardization of cut and sew patterns to the home, but while still allowing for some customization. So desktop 3D printers and the DIY movement have been talked about as being part of a revolution that makes the designer, the producer, and the consumer all one person. But the sewing machine was really the first of its kind to have this sort of impact. Now, although ready-to-wear clothing was more available, up until the mid-1900s, many clothes were still handmade. In contrast, today we think of handmade clothing as being too labor-intensive, so that usually equates to being too expensive. And it's more of a novelty today to get something custom-fitted and made just for us. Mending used to be an art. It still is, but it's just not practiced very much. A meticulous tailor or seamstress could mend rips with threads unraveled from hems and seams and skillfully weave them into tears that became practically invisible like this. So in the past, the material, the cloth, was worth more than labor, so it made sense to expend labor in order to save the cloth. And today, clothing is considered a consumable item. So the worth of this cloth or the garment is not valued above the labor that it takes to mend anymore. Mass manufacturing clothing is so inexpensive that many people usually just go out and buy a new piece of clothing rather than spend the time to fix it. If a button pops off today or a shirt gets a few holes in it, it's usually considered ruined, unwearable, and it's donated or thrown in the trash. So really, our relationship with clothing has changed. When did this happen, and why did it happen? When did clothing become so expendable, and when did fashion designers become these demigods that seemingly whip clothing out of thin air? In the book Overdressed by Elizabeth Klein, she starts with the history of the department store and how it began to become consolidated. She also points out that in the early days of the American garment industry, clothing manufacturing was run by independent, almost mom-and-pop businesses that sold through these numerous department stores before they became consolidated. In the 1970s, there was a shopping mall boom, and then also the disappearance of the middle class led Americans to start to embrace discounted prices that they were finding in department stores like Kmart and Walmart. So globalization was growing rapidly in the 80s and the 90s, and mid-priced brands began to shift the bulk of their production to the developing world where labor and overhead costs were a fraction of anywhere else. From the end of the 1990s, brands began to look for new ways to increase profits. And pricing battles ensued between department stores, aggressive ones. And they just started to create more and more bargain prices, more and more sales. So it came to be that the apparel industry became synonymous with globalization, consolidation, and the economics of publicly traded companies. So this brings us to the recent past. And in the last 2 decades, something totally remarkable has happened. And what I'm referring to is to fast fashion. This refers to the low-cost clothing collections that are usually characterized as throwaway. These are clothing you can find in places like H&M, Zara, and Forever 21. These companies have a team of designers that turn out 10,000 pieces of clothing a year. In contrast to, say, one luxury brand that used to or still does create 100 pieces per year. Now, the fashion industry used to, and it still does, but they only used to have collections twice a year. And that's spring, summer, and that's autumn, winter. But fast fashion has created something totally new, and they've collapsed the production line down so they can produce up to 50 collections a year, just churning out clothing into their stores. As Tansy Hoskins put it in her book, Stitched Up, quote, "Fast fashion is the result of competition having driven suppliers shorter and shorter supply times, and the market is also characterized by large international corporations owning clusters of brands and operating them internationally," unquote. So I think that having this experience with our fashion and our clothing has really led to a philosophy of constant deal hunting. And it's also led to a loss of appreciation for craftsmanship and clothing, craftsmanship and quality when it comes to clothing. Now, I worked as a clothing designer and a pattern drafter and a production seamstress as well. So, I've really seen people firsthand scoff at prices. Scoff at $30 for a shirt or anything over, and also scoff at any prices over $60 for a dress. So I think this is mainly because a lot of us have lost sight into what it actually takes to produce the clothing that we wear. In the 10-point anti-fashion manifesto authored by Lee Edencourt, she puts the way we value clothes and what they have to symbolize as this. Quote, "Prices profess that these clothes are to be thrown away, discarded as a condom and forgotten before being loved and savored, teaching young consumers that fashion has no value. The culture of fashion is thus destroyed," unquote. It's a very interesting read. Now, technology has always been in close relation with the fabric and the garments that we wear. Weaving is one of the oldest crafts and was among the first to become automated. The Jacquard Loom, which is pictured here, was among the first uses of stored data in commercial production through the use of punch cards you can see on the front. Now, interestingly enough, the use of punch cards, these punch cards were descendants of cards used in making musical organs and music boxes, and the descendants of these punch cards were then used for mechanical calculating machines and computer programming later on. So we know technology today, I think, as consumer electronics. These are our personal computers, our handheld devices, Arduino microcontrollers, and they're getting smaller and more ubiquitous. Wearable technology has also been around longer than some of you may think. For example, this one game changer, the pocket watch. But wearable electronics has really been the one bounding out of the gates and into the eyes of the masses lately, starting as social and data logging experiments and becoming the next new market that companies are looking to get involved with and identify. So the consumer electronics industry has some parallels to the fashion industry that I'd like to talk about. Now, it doesn't go as far back as the user need of clothes. It starts in the 1990s. But they've also become very personal and mobile. And with the production getting cheaper and smaller, electronics can be found in almost everything around us. So like fashion, its one overriding characteristic is the trend of ever-falling prices. I think this is partially driven by gains in manufacturing efficiency, and it's also partially driven by making profit margins larger every year. So I also want to mention planned obsolescence, which is designed into many of our electronic devices, which causes them to be throwaway. This creates an excess of products. Just as an example, in 1 year in the US, we can throw away 140 million cell phones that end up in the landfill. So this is another parallel to the fashion industry. And Vanessa Friedman, the New York Times fashion critic, put it really well. She made the point that the driving force of fashion is planned obsolescence, which is totally true if you think about it. She says something is in, then it is out, skirts are up, then they are down, today it's green, tomorrow blue, which is itself by definition about something that is the opposite of sustainable. So e-waste is dumped in places like India and China, and the people who live there are ultimately the ones who are made responsible for extracting any valuable or metals that are recyclable, which is a very difficult process and a very toxic one as well. So we purchase over 80 billion pieces of clothing each year, which is 400% more clothing today than we did 20 years ago. And sadly, like most of our electronic devices, they also end up as excess in landfills. So while working with wearable electronics and e-textiles, you get the best of both worlds. Flexible fibers with different qualifying properties, and the ability to run a signal through and around places and materials that you wouldn't normally get to. But with the best, you also get the worst, which I've already pointed out some of them. So precious metals are woven, knitted, and embedded under many layers of natural, synthetic, and hybrid materials. And this ultimately makes the metals and fibers even more difficult to separate. So if not designed with care, the integration of these metals with fibers can exacerbate an already difficult recycling and reuse process. Now, electronics and new technology is creeping into our lives more and more. I very recently just watched a talk given by Despina Papadopoulos just a few days ago. And she really happened to put some questions and concerns that I've been thinking about recently extremely well. So I'm going to share that with you, and I'm probably going to paraphrase a bit. So she asks, if wearable technology becomes part of our everyday life, then what kind of version of self do we want it to promote? What kind of values? What kind of idea of being? What kind of relationships can be made where value flows in all directions and not just to some? How do we make sure that we take care of each other, of our environment, and everyone who inhabits it? What do we want that to look like? And how do we want to make sure that everyone is valued? I just thought she really put that really well. So I'd also like to talk more about value and some concepts of sustainability that may help us to start to address these questions. I think in my mind, it really boils down to the fact that we need to change our relationship with our devices and the clothing that we wear. We may want to change what we value about them, other than the bottom line or the next deal. Perhaps we need to derive value from the narrative of the production of a garment itself. Today, wireless technologies such as Bluetooth and RFID are being developed, and they're being marketed to retail stores right now for new shopping experiences, and also ways to embed information into a garment or accessory. And as an example scenario that's actually put out by a company called Aware, who is developing this technology, they talk about a scenario of when you're walking down the street, or say you're standing in line for coffee and you see someone who has a really cute purse and you're thinking, okay, where did she get that purse? I have to have one. So instead of actually asking her and engaging her, if the purse has a chip in it and you have a downloaded app, you can scan the purse and it will pop up in the app and it will tell you what color you can get it in, where to get it, if it's on sale, and you can buy it right then and there. So you buy one for yourself, one for your mom, one for your sister, because it's a really great deal. So imagine if this technology was flipped on its head. And instead of getting information about where to buy the purse and more like it on sale, you learn about who made it and where they came from. So instead of educating the consumer on the story of production and the people behind it, giving value to the voices and stories to the hands that made the purse or the garment. And perhaps even what their specialty skills are and how they applied it to crafting the details that you can find in something. So it really gets you to look at the object that you're purchasing. Now this would make production process totally transparent. And I bet large conglomerates would not be thrilled to do this, of course, at this time, since a lot of them tend to abuse their labor. But what if this could be a reality? And who would it be to push this concept in front of people, just to let them know that they may or they can value something more than just a good deal? So what if this information also, or instead of, told a narrative of the wear of the garment, allowing information to flow across multi-generations of families or communities, sharing stories, memories of where it was made within that small community and from what local crops. I think interesting patterns may even emerge, telling the history and mythologies of a community and add to the already rich symbology that clothing provides. Fashion as an art form is very important. Like any art form, it mirrors what's going on in our communities and what's going on in our times. And it's something that we all partake in. It's self-referential, it's practical, and it's poetic. Fabrics shield you from weather. Material choices can communicate how rich you are or how little you make. Designs can reflect a whimsical part of someone's personality, or if someone's lost in time of mourning. Deciding what to wear or not to wear can be political and revolutionary. Clothing is already plenty smart, and it already has a big function in society. And so recently what I've found very interesting is how introducing technology and electronics can help amplify or add, or rather reintroduce this richness that clothing possesses. So this is a project that's a favorite of mine that uses this metadata concept. It's called Spin, and it creates a narrative behind the creation of a gift. And this gift is a knitted scarf. You can embed photos and audio captured along its journey of creation that you can then share later on with the person who receives the gift. So I feel like something like this could really change our view of something from disposable to a treasured heirloom, something that can be shared and passed on. Now it's worth mentioning that creating this metadata would also be creating some serious security risks, which again is why I think it's important to lift the hood of how these things work and how production works, how things are made, to help bring them back to the community and out of the conglomerate's grasp. So another way I think technology today can help perhaps change the way we value things is the open source culture. It's gone from sharing source code to an ideology of collaboration, transparency, and rapid prototyping. And fashion and textiles and electronics have followed suit. Designers are starting to offer a bill of materials and instructions on how to build knitting machines and looms that allow the wearer to create their own clothing using digital files. And designers are open sourcing their fashion collections you can download, cut, and put together. This collection, called Post Couture, even eliminates sewing through a tab and slot interlocking system. So modularity is a concept also to be looked at. This is a modular phone made by a company called Phone Blocks, and their motto is "a phone worth keeping." This design allows the user to replace a part of the phone if it wears out or breaks. The camera, USB port, the screen, even, which happens a lot. So instead of getting a whole new phone, you can just swap out your screen or the module. And this also leads to customization, so you can have as little or as many features as you want, and people feel more personal. So to make things last, they must evolve. And we don't always want to be limited to wearing just a few garments for the rest of our lives, right? People's tastes and their needs change. So clothing and electronics can evolve through something like a modular system that I just showed, but they can also evolve by recycling. William McDonough and Michael Braungardt's book, Cradle to Cradle, break end-of-use product materials into two categories. The first is technical nutrients, and this is synthetic materials manufactured by humans, like plastics and metals, that can be used many times over, but without a loss of quality, staying within a continuous cycle of recycling and use. And the second is biological nutrients, and these are materials that are organic and that can decompose into the natural environment, such as soil and water. They also go on to define the mixture of these technical and biological nutrients that cannot be separated and recovered at a product's end life, and they call these products monstrous hybrids. Hybrids typically also cannot be upcycled or downcycled, but instead end up in landfills and incinerators. So I think this is where material innovation can lend its hand. Fabric grown from bacteria or fungi that's biodegradable, or even using common materials that we already have, such as cotton and wool. And then couple these biomaterials with the technical materials, such as metal, so they can easily compost or dissolve within a custom-built system that then allows you to extract the metals easily to use again. And as we go forward with 3D printed fashion, maybe looking more at using biodegradable filament that can break down over time. So I think that overall, getting people more involved with the creation of their clothing can cause them to value it differently. Using innovations like virtual reality, for example, to imagine different color designs that are removable and 3D printed. Creating a modular garment that if you like the color, you can keep it, or if you want to swap it out for a new one, it can be thrown in the garden to compost. So there are a lot of exciting opportunities arising right now in the field of wearable electronics, and also funding is happening right now that's bringing it and boosting manufacturing on local soil. So I just think that this is a good time to start thinking about how to make some decisions of design that value a sustainable ideology. I've seen innovation happen in small clusters, only to be brought to market by companies that have more money to scale afterwards. And I've been within these small clusters, and I've talked to a lot of people, and I have a lot of great colleagues. And I've been to Shenzhen to see what it would even take to produce something that combines electronics and fabric. And aside from a handful of manufacturers creating new textiles, there isn't really anything that exists yet. But with companies like Google and Levi's creating Project Jacquard, for example, industrialization is now a goal and has the money to back it. So I think it just all comes back to, what would we like to see become a new reality as we build these new facilities and create these really exciting and innovating new products or projects? And I'm not trying to necessarily come with any easy solutions for some of the world's really large-scale problems, but rather I just wanted to come and share with you guys some of the concerns and topics of interest that I've been thinking about and that I think are important to consider as I see wearable electronics begin to scale as an industry. Thank you.